There comes a moment in a man's life when everything looks fine on the outside. But inside, something feels completely out of place. You wake up, you stay busy, you try to keep up with life, but deep down there is a silent question you can't ignore anymore. Why does my life feel so unorganized, even when I'm trying my best? And the truth most people never admit is this: your life doesn't fall apart in one big moment. It falls apart in small, invisible ways. One distracted decision, one wasted hour, one unmade choice at a time. Slowly, without noticing, you start losing control of your time, your focus, your habits, and eventually your direction. But what if the problem was never your effort? What if it was your structure? What if the reason you feel stuck, overwhelmed, or constantly behind is not because you are incapable, but because no one ever taught you how to organize your life from the inside out? Because, listen carefully, successful people are not doing 10,000 things differently than everyone else. They are simply following a set of principles that bring order where others have chaos. While most people react to life, a few learn how to direct it. While most people chase motivation, a few build systems that never depend on motivation at all. And once you understand these principles, everything changes. The way you think changes. The way you manage time changes. The way you control emotions changes. Even the way you see yourself begins to shift. So in the next few minutes, you are going to hear something that is not just motivational. It is practical, it is foundational, and it may quietly expose the reason your life has felt harder than it should. Because if you have ever felt like you are working hard but not moving forward, if you have ever felt mentally scattered, emotionally drained, or constantly behind in life, then what you are about to hear is not just information, it is a wake-up call. A life without clarity of purpose is a life constantly pulled in different directions, because when the mind does not know exactly what it is committed to, it becomes vulnerable to distraction, doubt, and external influence. The principle of definite purpose is not simply about setting a goal on paper, it is about reaching a state of mental certainty where your entire identity begins to revolve around a single clear direction. Most people fail not because they lack intelligence or opportunity, but because their energy is scattered across too many desires at the same time. One day they want success, the next day comfort, another day validation from others, and this internal conflict creates a silent confusion that slowly destroys momentum. When purpose is unclear, decisions become emotional rather than strategic, and emotional decisions rarely build long-term success. Clarity of purpose acts like a mental filter. It automatically separates what matters from what does not. Without it, everything feels important, and when everything feels important, nothing truly gets done. A person with no definite purpose wakes up and reacts to life instead of directing it. They check their phone before they check their vision. They respond to distractions before they commit to discipline. Over time, this creates a pattern where life feels busy but not meaningful. In contrast, when purpose becomes definite, the mind begins to simplify itself. Choices become easier because they are measured against one question: does this align with where I am going or not? This creates a powerful sense of inner order because confusion is replaced with direction. Definite purpose also reshapes identity. A person who is uncertain about who they are becomes easily influenced by circumstances. But a person who is clear about their purpose develops psychological resistance to distractions. They are no longer persuaded by temporary pleasures or emotional impulses because their attention is anchored to something larger than immediate comfort. This is where discipline becomes natural rather than forced. Instead of constantly fighting against procrastination, clarity reduces the need for inner conflict because the mind already knows what deserves priority. Even failures become more meaningful because they are interpreted through the lens of progress rather than discouragement. When purpose is unclear, time feels like it disappears without results. But when purpose is definite, even small actions feel meaningful because they are connected to a larger structure. The mind begins to think in terms of progress instead of activity. Energy becomes focused, conversations become intentional, and daily actions start forming a consistent direction rather than random motion. Over time, this clarity begins to reorganize everything from habits to decisions to relationships, because the internal compass no longer shifts with emotion or environment. Time is often treated as something that simply passes, but in reality it is one of the most strictly governed forces in human life. And the difference between those who succeed and those who remain stuck is not how much time they have, but how deliberately they command it. Mastery of time begins the moment a person stops seeing time as something to fill and starts seeing it as something to direct. Most people live in reaction mode, where their day is shaped by notifications, interruptions, and other people's priorities. In that state, time becomes fragmented, and fragmented time produces fragmented results. When attention is constantly broken, progress becomes slow, even when effort is high, because energy is being spent in multiple directions without depth or continuity. To command time is to assign value to every hour before the hour begins. It requires a shift from emotional scheduling to intentional scheduling. Instead of asking what feels easiest or most comfortable in the moment, the disciplined mind asks what action will produce the highest long-term return. This is where organization begins to separate itself from busyness. Busyness is movement without direction, while mastery of time is structured movement with purpose. When time is not controlled, it is consumed by urgency, and urgency is often created by neglect. The more you delay important tasks, the more they turn into pressure, and pressure then dictates your behavior. But when time is controlled in advance, urgency is reduced because priorities are already placed where they belong. True command of time also requires understanding that not all hours carry equal value. There are periods of high mental clarity, and there are periods of low energy, and a disciplined individual learns to assign meaningful work to peak mental states. This creates efficiency without burnout, because effort is aligned with natural rhythm instead of being forced randomly throughout the day. Over time, this creates a structure where productivity feels stable rather than unpredictable. The mind begins to trust the schedule, and when the mind trusts structure, resistance decreases. Another critical element of mastering time is learning to eliminate unnecessary commitments. Every yes to something unimportant is an unconscious no to something significant. Without awareness, people overload their time with obligations that do not align with their direction, and this leads to a life that feels constantly rushed but never fulfilled. Commanding time requires the courage to say no without guilt, because every protected hour becomes an investment into something meaningful. When time is guarded, focus deepens, and when focus deepens, results accelerate in a way that scattered effort can never achieve. Eventually, time stops feeling like something that controls you and starts becoming something that responds to you, where days are no longer random sequences of events but structured blocks of intention, and productivity becomes a reflection of design rather than chance. The idea that mental order creates physical order begins with a simple truth that most people overlook. The external world is rarely the real problem. It is usually a reflection of internal chaos that has not been addressed. When thoughts are scattered, inconsistent, and emotionally driven, that inner disorder naturally expresses itself through habits, surroundings, and decisions. A person may try to fix their room, their schedule, or their responsibilities, but if their thinking remains disorganized, the external environment will eventually return to the same state of disorder. The mind operates as the original blueprint, and everything that exists around a person is shaped by the quality of that blueprint. When thinking is unclear, priorities become mixed. And when priorities are mixed, actions lose structure. This is why many people find themselves starting tasks with motivation, but failing to complete them consistently, because the internal direction is not stable enough to sustain external discipline. Mental order begins when thoughts are no longer allowed to move randomly without direction. Instead of reacting to every impulse or distraction, the mind begins to categorize, filter, and prioritize. This process reduces internal noise and creates clarity, which then naturally translates into better decision-making. A person with organized thinking does not feel overwhelmed by choices because their mind has already eliminated unnecessary complexity. They are not constantly switching between ideas, tasks, or goals because their focus is anchored to what actually matters. This reduces friction in daily life because energy is no longer wasted on confusion or indecision. Physical disorder often reflects unresolved mental clutter. When the mind is overloaded with unfinished thoughts, unmade decisions, and unprocessed emotions, it becomes difficult to maintain structure in the physical environment. Small tasks are delayed, responsibilities are postponed, and spaces begin to reflect neglect rather than intention. Over time, this external disorder feeds back into the mind, reinforcing a cycle of stress and lack of control. However, when mental order is established, even simple actions like cleaning, organizing, and planning become natural extensions of clarity rather than forced effort. The environment begins to mirror a sense of control, and that external structure further strengthens internal stability. As mental order develops, discipline becomes less about struggle and more about alignment. A person no longer needs to constantly push themselves to act correctly because their thinking already guides them toward appropriate behavior. Decisions become faster, actions become more deliberate, and habits become more consistent because everything originates from a stable internal framework. This alignment creates a sense of calm efficiency. where life feels less chaotic, not because challenges disappear, but because the mind is no longer adding unnecessary disorder to those challenges, and every action begins to reflect a deeper sense of structure that originates from within. Daily non-negotiable habits are the hidden architecture behind every organized and successful life, because while goals define direction, habits determine whether that direction is actually followed or abandoned over time. Most people rely on motivation to structure their day, but motivation is inconsistent, emotional, and heavily influenced by external conditions. It rises and falls depending on mood, environment, and energy levels, which makes it an unreliable foundation for long-term progress. In contrast, daily habits operate as automatic systems that remove the need for constant decision-making. When certain actions become non-negotiable, they stop depending on how a person feels in the moment and start depending on identity and structure. This shift is what transforms scattered effort into consistent progress. The principle of non-negotiable habits is built on the understanding that success is not repeated in occasional bursts of intensity, but in repeated patterns of disciplined behavior. A person who trains, reads, plans, or works with consistency every single day, even in small amounts, will eventually outperform someone who acts only when inspired, even if that inspiration produces occasional high performance. This is because repetition builds momentum, and momentum reduces resistance. When an action is repeated daily, the mind begins to normalize it, and what once required effort slowly becomes automatic behavior. This is where life starts. Become organized, not through force, but through structured repetition. However, the key distinction is that these habits must be non-negotiable, meaning they are not subject to debate or emotional negotiation. The moment a habit becomes optional, it becomes vulnerable to delay, excuses, and inconsistency. When a person allows themselves to skip important habits just for today, they create internal permission for disorder. Over time, these small exceptions accumulate and weaken discipline. On the other hand, when habits are treated as fixed commitments, the mind begins to respect structure. There is no internal argument, no decision fatigue, and no wasted energy on whether or not to act. The action simply happens because it is part of the system. Non-negotiable habits also create stability and identity. A person begins to see themselves not as someone who tries to be disciplined, but as someone who operates within discipline. This identity shift is powerful because behavior naturally follows self-perception. When someone identifies as consistent, they behave consistently. When they identify as focused, they protect their attention more carefully. Over time, this shapes not just productivity, but emotional stability. Because structure reduces chaos in daily life, these habits also act as anchors during difficult periods. When life becomes unpredictable or emotionally heavy, habits provide continuity. Even when motivation disappears, structure remains. This prevents complete breakdown during stress because there is always a baseline of action that continues regardless of external conditions. That continuity builds trust within the self, reinforcing the belief that progress is not dependent on perfect circumstances, but on consistent behavior that remains intact regardless of fluctuations in mood, energy, or environment. Emotional control and focus is one of the most decisive forces behind a well-organized life, because even the most intelligent plans and disciplined routines collapse when emotions are left unmanaged. The human mind is naturally reactive, constantly responding to external triggers such as criticism, stress, pressure, uncertainty, and comparison. When a person lives under the influence of uncontrolled emotions, their decisions become unstable, their attention becomes fragmented, and their actions lose consistency. In that state, life is no longer directed by intention, but by impulse. And impulse rarely produces structure. Emotional instability creates internal noise, and that noise spreads into every area of life, making it difficult to maintain clarity, discipline, or long-term focus. When emotions are not controlled, they take priority over logic. A person may understand what they need to do, but in a moment of frustration or doubt, they abandon that understanding and react instead of respond. This is where progress is repeatedly interrupted. One emotional setback can undo days of discipline because the mind, when overwhelmed, seeks immediate relief rather than long-term benefit. This creates a cycle where effort is inconsistent, and inconsistency leads to disorganization. The ability to remain steady in emotional pressure is what separates those who build stable lives from those who constantly restart their progress. Focus is directly tied to emotional control because attention cannot remain stable in a chaotic inner environment. When emotions fluctuate, attention scatters. The mind jumps from one thought to another, often reacting to whatever feels urgent or uncomfortable in the moment. This fragmentation weakens productivity because energy is divided instead of concentrated. But when emotional control is developed, focus becomes stronger because the mind is no longer pulled in multiple directions by internal reactions. Instead, it can remain anchored on a single task or goal without unnecessary interruption. Emotional control does not mean suppressing feelings. It means observing them without allowing them to dictate behavior. A disciplined mind recognizes emotions as temporary signals rather than commands. Stress becomes information, not instruction. Frustration becomes awareness, not action. This shift creates space between feeling and response, and in that space lies the power of choice. When a person can choose their response rather than react automatically, they regain control over their direction. As emotional stability increases, focus becomes deeper and more sustainable. Tasks that once felt overwhelming become manageable because the mind is not constantly disturbed by internal fluctuations. Decisions become clearer because they are not influenced by temporary moods. Even in difficult situations, a person with emotional control remains anchored, allowing them to continue working toward their goals without being derailed by discomfort or uncertainty. Over time, this creates a steady rhythm of action where productivity is not dependent on emotional highs or lows, but on a consistent internal state that supports discipline and sustained attention throughout daily life. Decisive action and follow-through is the principle that turns thought into reality, because without execution, even the clearest vision remains nothing more than mental imagination. Many people spend their lives in a cycle of thinking, planning, and analyzing, believing that preparation alone is progress. Yet no real transformation occurs until action is taken consistently and completely. The difference between those who stay stuck and those who move forward is not intelligence or opportunity, but the ability to decide quickly and act without hesitation. Indecision creates delay, and delay slowly turns into habit. When a person repeatedly postpones action, they train their mind to associate effort with avoidance, and over time this weakens discipline and creates internal disorganization where ideas remain unfinished and goals remain unfulfilled. Decisive action begins with the willingness to commit fully to a choice without constantly revisiting doubt. A scattered mind often revisits the same decision multiple times, draining energy in the process of reconsideration. This creates mental fatigue even before any real work begins. But when a decision is made clearly and firmly, mental energy is preserved and redirected toward execution rather than hesitation. This clarity reduces internal conflict, allowing the individual to move forward with direction instead of hesitation. The mind becomes more stable when it is not repeatedly negotiating with itself, and stability leads to more organized behavior. Follow-through is the second half of this principle, and it is where most people fail. Many can start with enthusiasm, but few maintain consistency once the initial excitement fades. Action without continuation is incomplete energy, and incomplete energy produces incomplete results. Follow-through requires endurance beyond motivation because real progress often becomes visible only after repetition and persistence. It is in the continuation of effort, even when results are not immediate, that structure begins to form in life. Each completed task strengthens discipline, and each abandoned task weakens it. Decisive action also trains the mind to become less dependent on emotional approval. Instead of waiting to feel ready, a disciplined individual acts because the decision has already been made. This creates a pow, or if you will, shift, where behavior is no longer controlled by fluctuating moods but by commitment. Over time, this reduces procrastination significantly because the habit of acting becomes stronger than the habit of delaying. The mind learns that execution is the default response, not hesitation. As follow-through becomes consistent, life begins to reflect order rather than chaos. Tasks are completed, goals progress steadily, and unfinished work no longer accumulates to create pressure. This consistency builds trust within the self because the individual begins to see themselves as someone who completes what they start. That identity reinforces further action, creating a cycle where discipline strengthens itself through repetition. Eventually, action becomes natural, decisions become faster, and life begins to move in a structured direction where effort translates directly into tangible outcomes without unnecessary delay or interruption. And now, as you stand at the end of these principles, understand this with absolute clarity. A disorganized life is never a permanent condition. It is simply the result of untrained thinking and unfocused action. The moment you begin to apply structure to your thoughts, discipline to your habits, and intention to your decisions, life stops feeling random and starts becoming directed. You do not need a perfect moment to begin. You only need a decision that you will no longer live in chaos when order is possible. Every principle you have heard is not meant to impress you, but to challenge you to rise above the patterns that have kept you stuck, distracted, and uncertain. There will always be distractions competing for your attention, emotions trying to pull you away from discipline, and circumstances testing your focus. But none of these forces are stronger than a mind that has chosen structure over confusion. When purpose becomes clear, time becomes controlled, thinking becomes organized, habits become non-negotiable, emotions become disciplined, focus becomes sharp, and action becomes consistent. Life naturally begins to align in a direction that feels powerful and intentional. This is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming structured enough that progress is no longer accidental but inevitable. What separates transformation from intention is not knowledge, but execution. What you do after this moment will define whether these ideas remain inspiration or become your reality. The opportunity to change your life does not exist in the future. It exists in your next decision, your next habit, and your next action. If you choose discipline today, your tomorrow will begin to reflect order. If you choose focus today, your future will begin to reflect direction. Move forward with courage, stay committed when motivation fades, and trust the process even when results are not immediate. Build slowly, but build consistently. Protect your time, guard your focus, and refuse to live in unnecessary chaos when clarity is within your control. Good luck on your journey of transformation, and may every step you take from this moment forward bring more structure, strength, and success into your life. Thank you.